This was looking to a pilot for using the 5 capitals approach for marine plan development in the east coast of England. Okay, so just a quick bit of background. So this was a thought piece commissioned by the MMO, and it was a pretty short end of financial year project. So we had 2 months really to get it done. And the idea was to look at, whether a 5 capitals approach could inform carrying capacity and support marine plan development. And the focus was the East Marine Plan area in England, and we were asked to focus on 3 specific sectors, so offshore wind, fisheries and aggregates. And just on the right to highlight that this is a team effort within HMC and also with the MMO. So a lot of people involved in this project. So a quick background in terms of the 5 capitals approach. Everyone here is obviously aware of natural capital, but the other 4 being social capital, so communities, schools, businesses, parts of society. Human capital, so this focuses more on the individual, so health, skills, qualifications. There's financial capital, which is obviously money and economics. And then there's manufactured capital, which is the built environment around us. And so the 5 capitals approach was first developed by Jonathan Porritt, and the idea was to look at it more of a business organization approach to review an organization and consider how effectively it's using these various assets from the 5 capitals within their organizations and looking at becoming more efficient. It's been adopted by the Capitals Coalition, although they look at 4 capitals. They don't include financial capital. And there's also another model that looks at a 6th capital of intellectual capital. However, we didn't feel that the 6th capital really applied to what we were looking for, and we felt that the 5 capitals approach really fit the approach that we were looking for. So within the report, there were 3 key components. The first part was looking at potential benefits and challenges of applying the capitals approach to describing and identifying carrying capacity and managing trade-offs for space. The second part was looking at the approach in marine planning decision-making. And then the third part was considering how the approach can be scaled up across multiple sectors and multiple plan areas. So there's a lot of detail within those 3 sections, but for my presentation, I'm just going to be looking at section 2, and this was developing asset registers, what we termed asset network diagrams, and a conceptual framework to build the capitals approach into decision making. So the first part was developing asset registers, and this was basically a huge data search, looking at the 3 sectors under the 5 capitals, what kind of assets we would consider to put into an asset register. And the first thing to consider was that the asset register we developed was going to be a snapshot in time, and that to be a useful register, you'd have to regularly update it, and with that comes additional cost and resource implications. So the asset register we developed for this is true for last spring, but even now it may need updating. Accessibility, so access to data, that we use publicly available data, but there are obviously other sources of data that aren't publicly available and may need to be purchased, or there may be a data gap where you need a new assessment to fill that data gap, and that's a decision that needs to be made in the process of developing the register. There are questions around whether the data that's available is suitable in terms of scale, and whether it's appropriate to the question being asked. And when it's available at a large scale, is it possible to disaggregate it down to provide information at the relevant scale that you're looking at? So a national database being relevant to a regional area. And then lastly, we're looking at, we wanted data that can be comparable across sectors. So if we're looking at trade-offs, where possible, we want the same information to be available to inform those trade-offs. So this is just a screenshot of part of the asset register, so as an Excel spreadsheet. I apologize that it's very small for some people using their laptops. But the idea was that on the left-hand side, you've got your 3 sectors. and you can filter the spreadsheet down depending on which sector or sectors you're interested in. Next to those are the 5 different capitals, and again, you can filter the spreadsheet down to the specific capitals you're interested in, and there's even subsets within those capitals, so infrastructure or equipment there under manufactured capital. And then on the right-hand side, it's the more detailed information about the status of that asset. So with this large matrix, essentially, you can filter down to address specific questions or interests you have. I'm going to skip on to the next slide. The whole asset register is available to download from the MMO website as well, so you can look at that. It's one of the downloads along with the report itself. So once we've developed that asset register, and that provides us with a record of assets and their condition, the next question is, what do we do with that information, and how do we present that information? So it's one way of spatially mapping it out, so plotting it out, and that can quite quickly become complicated and messy. And so we tried to find or develop a simplified way of presenting this information, and we came up with what we're terming asset network diagrams. And so the key points of these diagrams were to be able to associate the capitals with the different assets, to identify relationships between the assets, identify which assets are important, and identify linkages between sectors, so which assets appear for multiple sectors. And so for this part, I'm just going to kind of talk through how we built one of these asset networks. And so this one's going to be for the offshore wind sector. So on the right hand side, sorry, you've got the kind of color coding for the different type of capital. So green being natural, orange social, red human, grey manufactured, and blue financial. So for offshore wind, starting with like natural capital assets, you have the wind asset. Obviously, you have the seafloor where the turbines are going, and you have construction materials. And these are connected to the turbines themselves. And then extending on from the turbines, you have operation and maintenance vessels, you have the onshore and offshore substations, and you have cabling. And then building on from that, at the top, you have harbour and port, and there's a financial implication there for berthing costs for vessels. At the bottom, you have the energy that's produced, which is a natural capital asset. And in the center, you have your human capital, which are the people employed to work within the operation and maintenance vessels, the harbours and ports, and working on the turbines. And then there's a training and education component to that, which connects to human capital. And then stemming off from employment, you have financial capital like income tax, and then disposable income, and those link to your local community, which is a social capital asset. And so the employment could be people coming from the local community that are employed, or people moving to the local community for employment opportunities. And then lastly, at the bottom, you have, following on from energy, you have the market where the energy is sold. So that's a social capital. You have the national grid with which it's shared across the country. So that's manufactured capital. And then you have the product value and the sector community. So that would be all the companies and organizations linked to the sale of energy on the market. And they link again back to employment. So we found that by laying them out, the different assets in this way, it gives quite a nice overview of the different assets, the distribution of the 5 capitals within this system, and a good way in how all the assets interact with one another. And so you'll notice that for employment, harbour and port, and local community, they have this kind of dash circle, and that's because these are assets that link to other sectors. So if I bring up now the aggregate sector network, again, it's a very similar structure. So you have your natural capital at the beginning on the right, marine sand and gravel, and then that links to things like vessels, landing weights, harbours and port, employment. And you can see that there's a bit more social capital here on the left, where you build in aggregate processing and the different companies and organisations associated with that. And then the last one is the fishing community. Again, starting with your natural capital assets, where you've got more natural capital assets. So you've got spawning grounds, nursery areas, and then the fish stocks themselves. Again, you have your fishing vessels, the types of equipment used, your landing weights at the bottom, and then you can follow that through to having fish being sold in a market, and then that from the market they're then sold onto fish tourism or seafood processing. And what kind of stands out differently from this network to the others is the increased amount of social capital through the fishing community, which is a subset of the local community. So you then have training, culture, tradition, and fishers' missions and fisheries associations. So I guess through this approach, as I mentioned, you can kind of visually represent the different capitals, and using this approach, you can also make these as complicated and broad or as simplified and small as you'd like, and it all depends really on the kind of question you're asking. So moving on from that approach where we get an understanding of like the systems and how the capitals fit within that system and the interactions, we then moved on to developing a kind of conceptual framework that can try and incorporate 5 capitals into decision-making processes. And so there are 4 stages to this. The first stage was defining the question and identifying the aims and priorities. So this is really where you define your area of interest, you define the question you want to ask, you identify key sectors that you want to incorporate into the process, and you identify priorities for the sector, society, and the environment. And then using that sets the focus of what you want to do in the second stage, which is develop your asset register. So you're identifying the relevant capitals for each of the sectors, and you're collecting data and evidence to inform that asset register. And that then establishes a core database that everyone involved from now on is referring to. So in stage 3, this is where you really focus in on stakeholder participation, and this could be expert opinion, could be local community groups, could be industry representatives, a whole range of people, and it's at this stage where you start to build those asset networks. So you have your asset registers with the assets of interest, and using stakeholder input, you develop that network and you identify what the key assets are, how they interact with one another. And you can also go through the process of assigning relative values to each of these assets. So trying to move away from financial value and being able to compare them all on the same scale and the same metric. There are different ways of assigning relative values. We haven't gone into that detail within the report, but that's certainly one of the recommendations coming from the report. And then once you've identified these relative values, you can then start to play around with, if there's an impact or something changes, how does that manifest through the system? How does changing the natural capital asset, for example, impact on human capital within the system or on the social capital? And that's where you get through to stage 4, where you start to build, you start to use scenario modeling to look at how different scenarios impact differently on the different capitals in the system itself. And then through that process of scenario modeling, it then is up to the decision maker to use that to inform decisions. So as part of the process of developing this, I appreciate this is very small, but it's just to highlight that we ran a workshop running through this process with people from marine planners from the MMO, and going from left to right, you have this first stage where you are identifying your question. The second part is developing your asset register. This part in the middle is really developing the network assets, the asset networks, identifying relative values. And through that process, this next step along is giving you an idea of like a status quo of the relative values of each of the sectors and broken down by each of those capitals. And then using that status quo, you can run through different scenarios, these are all kind of hypothetical. But for this question, we were looking at, okay, if you wanted to reach your 50 gigawatt target of offshore wind development, this first scenario, how would that impact on the other sectors and the different capitals? Scenario 2 was if you wanted to just maximize the amount of offshore wind you could possibly build in the North Sea, how would that then impact on fisheries and aggregate sectors? And then the last scenario is if you wanted to meet an 80% target, again, what would the impact be on those other sectors? So I think it's, it's a good way, I think, of building stakeholders into a fairly transparent process and being involved in the decision making and the information that informs the scenario modeling. But to kind of conclude, and say, I think we see this as an opportunity for transparent decision making that considers multiple dimensions and values. It is a question-driven approach with a particular problem or policy objective in mind. So in this case, we were really focusing on marine plan development and trade-offs. But I was having a conversation with a colleague just yesterday talking about climate adaptive fisheries. And you can focus in just on, okay, if we're looking at shifting fish stocks, how would that affect the fishing communities? And then run that through, like, it affects your natural capital asset with, a fish stock moving away, a new fish stock moving in. Well, what are the implications on that for fishing vessels, for training, for employment, for the local market and tourism opportunities? So it provides a way to look at changes through a whole system. It brings together a varied evidence base and a range of stakeholders, and it can inform complex issues like carrying capacity, values, and trade-offs. There's more detail of that in the report itself, but stressing that it's not a silver bullet for decision making. It's something that can help inform decision making alongside many other things, such as cumulative effects assessments and considering other components like that. So that concludes my presentation. As I said, there's a lot more information in the report itself, but I'm happy to try and answer any questions on that. I'll stop sharing my screen. You're on mute, Marion. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Sam. I've got a few questions, but Kathy, I think you were first.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. That was really interesting. I think I understand it a bit better now. I just had a question. I mean, maybe it was just we weren't seeing some of the things were a bit small to read, but I wasn't quite clear how, when you showed the network maps, how it captures the kind of impacts and interactions, say, between, you were talking about, say, fishing or even renewables. Where does that sort of information about, the potential impacts on the natural capital come into those maps to allow you then to work out, what the interactions are, and then therefore to work out, what happens if you scale that up, etc. And then linked to that, if I can just kind of carry that point on, my only kind of concern, not knowing much about this, is that kind of we kind of came up with marine natural capital, I thought, because it was a way of sort of looking at the bits of the system that weren't valued effectively in kind of traditional economics. And so my slight concern about putting back in the manufactured and the kind of economic finance side is that we're kind of, do we risk watering down again the natural element of that, or is it just a very helpful thing to be able to directly compare those kind of traditional financial values with what's coming through from the natural sort of assessment? So yeah, you can maybe just keep me right on that.
Sure. I'll answer that second question first because it's fresh in my mind, I guess. So I think there's been an important move to try and understand the role that natural capital plays and the value that it has in terms of supporting ecosystem services. I think where we're getting to now is like, what does that mean for society? What does that mean for human decision making in terms of what do those ecosystem services deliver? How important are they? And so I think what these asset networks really do is highlight the foundational value of natural capital, because it's really at the start of the network and everything stems from that natural capital asset. That's how we try to present it. And you can see how things like when we presented the networks to the social scientist, he was really surprised to see how important human capital was within those apps, because it's bang in the center and it links to everything. And so without that human capital, we don't have people to go out and catch fish. We don't have that training. And so I guess it puts natural capital in the context of that wider system, but I don't think it waters down the value of natural capital. And if anything, I think it kind of emphasizes the importance of it. The first question you asked was about impacts on natural capital and how that's captured within this. And there are obviously a lot of things that kind of run alongside. This is a very simplified version of trying to map out what are the assets and how are they linked. And I think it really comes down to the question you're asking, is where you would bring in the question around, well, how does this impact affect other sectors? How does it manifest through these systems? And I think when you're developing your asset register, you're getting an understanding, okay, what is the current status? And if your question is around how an impact on a habitat, for example, affects that system, you can then get an understanding of how it may affect the status of those assets. But this is a question that kind of came up in terms of external stresses and how they're captured. And I think it's important to recognize that this approach doesn't sit in isolation and do everything. It runs alongside other things like cumulative effects assessments, and that can inform the interactions within this system and give a better understanding of, and vice versa. So if you're looking at how effects accumulate through a system, this can display it in that way as well. I hope that's kind of answered your question. Right, thanks.
Right. Okay. Vicky, do you have a question?
Thanks, Sam. That was really interesting. I enjoyed it. I've been sent a copy of the report, but I hadn't had a chance to open it, so that's great. And I do think it's a very nice way to sort of show the system. It's sort of they have elements of a sort of systems diagram we showed, and I think that's really helpful. Both of my questions are a bit semantic, and you'll probably be irritated by them, but I'm assuming because you HMC have had time to sort of lots of discussions and workshops. You've actually been asked these questions before and have got answers, so I just hope to hear the answers. But the first point that I felt was that I'm sort of embedded in the natural capital world, and so I think of natural capital as capital assets, and then services and benefits and values flow from them, and yet you'd use one symbol and one color to represent the natural components of the system, but they weren't all natural capital. Some of them were flows of services from natural capital, and I was thinking, if I was doing it, I'd probably use a different shaped symbol or something to show that it was natural, but it wasn't actually a natural capital asset. It was, but so I just wondered how you do it with that. And do you want my next question, or do you want to do that one first?
I'll quickly answer that one. So we played a lot around with the natural capital, the network, asset models, and it's very easy for them to become very complicated very quickly. And we saw them as a kind of communication tool to kind of get people to understand how a system works and how to kind of link the different capitals to different components within that system. And as I mentioned, you can build these networks out to as wide as you want them to be, and you can add in these other components of flows and capital assets and services and things like that. But in terms of this kind of stakeholder participation component of it, and trying to get people bought into understanding the system and being able to input into it, we felt that this kind of simplified approach would work best. But you can build on it how you see fit, I think, depending on what kind of question the stakeholders you're working with.
Thank you. The other question was about social capital, because out of my personal curiosity, really, I've been sort of looking from time to time at definitions of social capital, and it's quite difficult and nebulous often. And I thought your definition looked quite pleasingly sort of practical, but other definitions I've looked at are about trust in society and equitability in society and networking and how connected people are. And that's not, I think, what you were talking about there. Have you got an answer to that, or a way that is practical to approach it?
So we found social capital the hardest one to kind of get our heads around and understand how it fit into the system. And we had, a number of calls with social scientists to try and figure out how we could fit it into the system. And the biggest challenge we had with social capital was around scale. How do you define a community? Because a community for business and a local community operate at different scales. And if you're looking at a marine region, you're going to have multiple communities within that. So how could you simplify that down into one value for social capital value? And so that was, in the report, there is a recommendation around further understanding, like research needed in how we understand social capital and how we can incorporate it into this kind of model and decision making. So yeah, I think we try to keep it as simple as possible. But yeah, like a lot of these things, the more you look into it, the more complicated it becomes.
Thank you.
Chris?
Julia first, I think.
Oh, all right then.
Thanks, Chris. It's really interesting tool and really good to have a visual. I thought it was really clear snapshot and great for top level kind of decision making. And I can see that there's all these other layers that you can add to it. How long does the process take? So it looked like you did a day workshop maybe with one question to tease out one question and then develop those charts.
Yeah, so basically we went into the workshop with all of the charts already made up,
right,
and kind of and talked through the process and kind of stress test it to see, okay, where are the key issues, where are the unknowns, and yeah, we haven't actually gone through the process of bringing a stakeholder group together and developing asset network. We just didn't have time to really do anything like that. We know that the MMO are interested in this approach and are looking to build on the work we've done to look at local governance and how to bring in stakeholder participation into decision making in this kind of a way. But in terms of what I presented here, we just for time really, we had to go in with a pre-made decision-making process and scenarios made up so that we could just talk about that rather than go through the development process.
So that took a matter of weeks to prepare and then a one-day workshop?
Well, in terms of building the asset register, that took a few weeks to get all the data together and build it and design it. In terms of getting the asset networks together, once we figured out what we wanted to do, it was quite straightforward and quite enjoyable, like building this system. If you know what all the components are, put them out on a mirror board and then think about how they all link together and lay out. It's quite an enjoyable activity. And then the actual scenario building, that probably took us a day or two to really talk about, well, what is it we're actually changing here? How do they impact each other? And it was all hypothetical figures, but we had to think through, well, what does this actually mean for the other sectors? What are the trade-offs? What are the interactions and how do they interact? Yeah.
You need that human element. You need the analysis from a human being. You couldn't do all of this. You couldn't feed the information and then let a machine sort of produce the diagrams.
I think what you need to, the real important human element is about what are the key assets, what are their relative values compared to other, but once you build that network and you see it, it's easy to think, right, ports and harbors are really important assets, because there's so many sectors that use those assets, that people employed there, without those, things fall apart. Like natural capital, it's really important. If that weakens and you lose that, then the whole system falls down. So you can kind of identify what are the key assets within the system, and you can build values around that. We talked about the potential to build for building like software where you could input the assets, their values, and weighting interactions and things like that. And so you put in the details, and then it spews out like how these change when you alter values and interactions, and use that for like some kind of scenario modeling. But that was all hypothetical. Like, wouldn't it be great to have this?
Yeah. Thanks.
It really lends itself to something that you could put into like an ecological model. If you could model all that, if someone could build some software with all these values in it, and you could say the area of your activity and what the interactions were, could come up with an answer.
Yeah, be great.
Chris, I think we've got time for
yeah, I'll try and be quick,
then.
but yeah, it did occur to me as well. It's a lot like a sort of a Bayesian networks type model. So I've got two questions. The first one is technical, so feel free to just tell me to go and read the report. And it's just thinking about the scenario modeling. So you talked about the sort of deciding the relative values of the different assets. Presumably, ideally, you also need to understand the strength and the direction of the relationships between assets, because they might be positive, they might be negative, they might be one way or two way, all sorts of, they might be initially positive, but then you overexploit and you've got all of a sudden a negative relationship. Presumably that's all possible, maybe not quantitatively, but depends how complicated you're prepared to make it.
Yeah, so I think the kind of the stakeholder engagement component was really about getting a better understanding of those interactions and those feedback loops and things like that, and the values. But then, that scenario modeling bit is kind of built upon that. So you need that stakeholder engagement and the workshopping to identify those values and interactions, and then that's the basis for the next step, rather than having standardized interactions or values that you use wherever you go. So it's built upon local expertise and knowledge.
Okay, great, thank you. And my second question is maybe just do you see a clear benefit to this over the 4 capitals approach? What do you think this does that doesn't?
It's a good question. I think the reason the Capitals Coalition focused on 4 capitals instead of 5 was because financial capital was a product of the other 4. So if you focused on 4, then that financial capital would take care of itself, right? Yeah. But we felt it was important to include financial capital here because it provides important links between assets. So if we were thinking about in all of them, actually, there's the vessels, and then there's the harbours and port, and there's that berthing costs, which is this important financial product of that link between the 2 assets. But it's a good question. We didn't really explore it in much detail in terms of if we just dropped financial capital, how would it affect?
So I suppose it also gives the capacity to represent financial investment in natural capital. So it's not just the finance is not just the endpoint, it's an input as well.
And you can see it as investment into upskilling, increasing human capital. And if you had to adapt in some way, where would you refocus investment to ensure that you can adapt to changes within the system? But yeah, interesting question.